All right, epidemiology students, we're covering material from Chapter 12, where we're talking about infectious disease epidemiology, and we'll be talking some about the different terms and the different calculations later on in this chapter. But before doing this, I wanted to talk just for a couple of minutes about some of the different microbial agents of infectious diseases. In the previous recording, I talked a little bit about bacteria, how they were once the leading killers, but now with us having antibiotics, we're able to control a number of different infections within individuals as well as within populations. They still remain a significant cause of illness, and I'll demonstrate just in a couple of minutes the concern that we have today about the emergence of antibiotic-resistant strains. But here's a list of some common bacterial infections. Many of these on this list you are probably familiar with, be it maybe tuberculosis or anthrax or botulism, cholera you've heard of probably, gonorrhea we've talked about in this class, we've talked about leprosy or Hansen's disease. By no means is this an all-inclusive list. And I also want to make sure that you understand when you go through this list, I want you to just be familiar with it, but you are not expected to memorize every bacteria that's listed out and their common disease presentations that you would see on this list. But I just want to demonstrate to you the different types of bacterial infections, and many of them you're familiar with. Some of them on this list you probably never have heard of. We spent a couple of minutes talking about pertussis, but we talked about in this class about with Lyme disease and that. But then there's others we haven't really talked about, typhus or cat scratch fever and that. That's where the communicable disease course that I teach in the fall allows for us to be able to go into quite a bit of detail about each of these different infectious diseases. But as I said, one of the real concerns that we have with bacterial infections is antibiotic resistance. We have the ability to treat many of those those bacteria or those infectious diseases on that previous list, but with resistance becoming more commonplace, it becomes concerning in the sense that we are beginning to lose some of those options when it comes to being able to treat many of these different types of bacterial infections. So individuals that have totally drug-resistant tuberculosis, as demonstrated at the bottom right-hand corner, there isn't a lot of treatments that are available or avenues to pursue when it comes to individuals that have this particular bacterial strain. And then we have MRSA, which it was often termed as a nosocomial or a hospital-borne infection, but now we're seeing it more so out in the community. And then we have others like your antibiotic-resistant gonorrhea, as well as Shigella that is demonstrating resistance. As I said in the previous recording, one of the assignments that I do want to make sure that you are all aware of is that you are asked to watch the documentary of Hunting the Nightmare Bacteria. The website for that particular video can be found on that link there. I do ask you to watch that and take notes, because there will be an additional exam question. And this is just to get you familiar or even more comfortable with understanding the challenge that we are beginning to face as public health officials as we go forward with antibiotic resistance. We're now going to move for a couple of minutes into talking about viruses and rickettsia. A virus we could go into a lot of detail about it. You can see that in parentheses it's the term microorganism, but remember with a virus it's not technically alive, but it's a microorganism that's smaller than bacteria, and it cannot grow or reproduce apart from a living cell. This is a scenario where you have a little almost like a little machine. You have DNA or RNA within a protein coat, where this particular virus or a certain type of a virus will invade a living cell and use the different machinery in that particular cell, take over the machinery of the cell for replication, the process of replication. The concern about viruses is that it does then cause an immune response, and it can cause serious disease as a result. Whereas with rickettsia, rickettsia falls under this list with viruses, but rickettsia is a bacteria. It's a gram-negative bacteria that combines both aspects of bacteria and a virus, in the sense that rickettsia are obligate intracellular parasites, is that they can only reproduce inside a living cell. So here you have a bacteria that cannot live outside of a living cell, or cannot reproduce outside of a living cell. The organism can occur within the cytoplasm, within tissue cells, or can live free in the gut of arthropods. A lot of students aren't very familiar with rickettsia, whereas with viruses, we're much more familiar with them. You can see, for example, on this list here, a number of the different viruses, from HIV to chickenpox to the common cold. We've talked about dengue fever within this class, with hepatitis. Many of you have heard of hand, foot, and mouth disease, but probably didn't know that it was actually a viral infection. HPV with cervical cancer, influenza, measles, mumps, polio, rabies, several different viruses that you can see within this list. Once again, this is not an all-inclusive list of all viruses that can infect humans, but just a list that you can see that it's quite extensive when you look at this. As I said with bacteria, I don't expect you to memorize this particular list. It's just become familiar with some of the different viruses that are on that. Whereas with rickettsia, you can see here a list of different types of rickettsia. Some of them that are on this list is, like, for example, Rickettsia rickettsiae. This is a bacteria or rickettsial infection that is termed as Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And this is a tick-borne infection. It's transmitted by ticks. And what's interesting about Rocky Mountain spotted fever, because of its name, one would think that most of the infections would be occurring within the Rocky Mountains. But in reality, it happens more in central United States, as well as in North Carolina, as well as in Tennessee, in the mountains in those areas, where we do see a higher incidence in those states than we do in the Rocky Mountain area. So students often will ask, well, why is it that it's called Rocky Mountain spotted fever? And the reason is because this is where in Colorado is where it was originally identified, or it was first recovered from ticks and that. And so from there it was thought to be primarily found within the Rocky Mountains, but as scientists began to look in other places, they were able to see that it wasn't just limited in those locations. You can see here also from this list that many of these rickettsial infections are not limited to humans. Many of them also are zoonotic in nature, and that they have other animals that they are associated with. You can look here also at the incidence rate, and this is what's concerning when we talk about Rocky Mountain spotted fever, as well as with a number of these other rickettsial type infections, is that the incidence has begun, we've been seeing an increase in that. And you start to ask, as an epidemiologist, why do we have an increase in incidence? And the hypothesis behind that is that humans, are beginning to recreate even more so in those areas where those ticks exist, and allowing for transmission to occur. We'll move over and talk just for a couple of minutes about mycoses, or fungal diseases. Fungus acts like a pathogen. Unlike the benefits that we see with penicillin, we know that penicillin falls under those mycotic scenarios. But here, with fungal diseases, it'll act as a pathogen. Primarily, most fungal diseases are a result of opportunistic type infections, where individuals that are immunocompromised will often have these types of infections, or they may be hospital associated. Once again, a scenario where an individual will be immunocompromised or in the hospital typically for another treatment and due to the lowering of the immune system or the changing of the gut or changing of the skin bacteria, you would have these infections occur. But then we have seen a number of mycotic outbreaks that have occurred, like valley fever, histoplasmosis within the community. And the concern behind some of that is that you begin to ask, is there an association potentially behind some climate change that's occurring where we are beginning to see more and more of these cases? Some of you are familiar with a number of these fungal infections, be it through blastomycosis or candidiasis or cryptococcus or Taenia pedis. This is your athlete's foot. So almost every single one of us have had some form of athlete's foot or have had different types of fungal infections within the genital area. Candidiasis is one of those fungal infections that can be found in exposed and moist parts of the body, like the vagina, the penis, the foreskin, and all that around the nostrils. And that a lot of times we will see candidiasis infections occur in newborns in the mouth, just because the immune system isn't up to date, or is not up to date, but has not fully matured out. We'll move on to talk just for a second or two about protozoa. Protozoa are considered one-celled organisms that are free-living or parasitic in nature. They're able to multiply in humans as well as in other animal scenarios, or zoonotic type infections. And they can develop into serious infections. Some protozoa are also transmitted through a fecal-oral route or by way of an arthropod or a mosquito or sandfly. Many of you have heard of malaria being the most important protozoal infection that we have worldwide. But then we don't have malaria here in Cache County or in the United States. We do have a little bit in the United States and occasionally with certain outbreaks in that occurred, and then they're controlled, or they have been controlled. But many of you should be familiar with Giardia, and that's a parasite infection through contaminated water sources that one can get when they're, for example, recreating or camping and that. I'll spend just a second or two talking a little bit about leishmaniasis, since that's some of the work that I do within my lab. But this is a parasite that's transmitted by sandflies. It has three different types of infection presentations, be a cutaneous type infection, and you can see an image of that where the parasite will infect the soft tissues and cause an abscess or an infection in the skin or in the soft tissue there. And then you have a mucocutaneous, where a sandfly will inject the parasite in the areas around the nose, the mouth, and the eyes, where it can cause infections within those parts of the soft tissue, and it can cause pretty significant deformities as a result. And then there's visceral or black fever, and this is where the parasite can actually migrate to the liver and the spleen, and it can cause death as a result of those visceral or that visceral infection. There's no treatment that's available, or no vaccine that's available, but there's very good chemotherapy. So the challenge, though, that you face with leishmaniasis is that a lot of these will leave pretty significant scarring as a result. And so the idea behind, from an epidemiologist standpoint, is you want to be able to prevent infection from even occurring. And vaccines are not an option at this current time frame.